Today I'm sharing my 10 favorite DIY craft projects using wood items from the Dollar Tree. These projects are budget friendly, super easy, and perfect for adding a custom touch to your home decor. So grab your Dollar Tree wood finds and let's get creative together. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more DIY inspiration. For this project, I started out with 3 of the mini pallets that you can find at the Dollar Tree, as well as 3 of the mini wooden crates. I took the antique wax by Waverly and I applied it to all 3 of the pallets using a baby wipe. I like to use the baby wipes because it kind of eliminates a step. It sort of applies the wax and takes off the excess at the same time. While the pallets were drying, I got to work on the wooden crates. I took the ink color by Waverly and I gave each of the boxes 1 coat of this paint. It's pretty thick and pretty pigmented, so I didn't feel like I needed more than 1 coat, but I did make sure that I got the entire outside and the inside as well. The pallets already had a piece of jute rope on them, and I decided to keep it on there and reuse it to connect the 3 pallets together. So on 2 of the pallets, I just cut the jute cord in half and I left 1 of the ropes intact. So that's going to be my top pallet. Then I took the next one and I laid my ruler down so that I could keep the spacing even between the next 2. I applied some hot glue to the inside edge of the pallet and I just placed the rope inside. Back on the front side of the pallets, I used my hot glue again to attach the wooden crates towards the bottom of each pallet. Now, if you can't tell, this is a hanging piece and I think there's many uses for it. I decided to use mine as decoration. I put some decorative rocks in it and some succulents, but I think it would also make a great addition to a coffee bar. You could add some K-cups, some sugar packets, some tea bags. You could do anything you'd like with it, or you could even use it in an office to organize some office supplies. I had this black and white buffalo check ribbon in my stash and I decided to create a simple embellishment for the front of each of my crates. I added a band of the ribbon around the center where you could see the divider on there, so it made it really easy to glue it around. And when I hot glue ribbon down, I don't add a ton of hot glue because I'm always afraid it's going to seep through and you're going to see it. So I tried to keep the hot glue towards the back edges of the crate, and then I just placed 1 dot of hot glue on the very front center so that you wouldn't really be able to see it. Once the ribbon band was in place, I had created a simple shoestring bow out of the same ribbon and I hot glued that on the front. The Dollar Tree always carries tag-shaped signs, and I'm always drawn to them. I seem to have an overabundance of them. I grabbed one of the signs to use as a background, and I also had 2 of these mini drawers that I also found at the Dollar Tree. I flipped the sign over, and I'm giving it 1 coat of green chalk paint. After my paint was dried the whole way, I took my sanding block and I started roughing over the edges. I wanted it to have a worn look, but I didn't want that distressed look that you get from paint, and because this is a wood sign, I knew that if I sanded off a little bit of that paint, some of that wood would show through to give it that distressed look that I like. Using my ruler, I found the center of the sign, added a pencil mark, and then I also found the center of the backside of the drawer. And I ran a pencil line the whole way down the backside of the drawer so that when I went to glue it in place, I would have a guide. I could just line up the 2 lines and I would know where I needed to glue my first drawer. For the top drawer, I just eyeballed how far apart I wanted it from the bottom drawer, and then I repeated the same thing. I marked on the sign where the center was, and then I marked the center back of the drawer, added some hot glue, lined my 2 marks up together, and glued it into place. I grabbed some of the cotton twine that you can find at the Dollar Tree. This usually isn't in with the crafting stuff. It's usually found in the automotive section. I cut a length off and I folded it in half. I fished the loop through the top hole of the tag, pulled the ends through, and let them hang to the side. Then I grabbed my sanding block and I wrapped the cotton twine around my sanding block about 25 times or until I felt like it was thick enough for a tassel. Then I pulled the string down that I had attached to the top of the tag, and I tied a knot where I wanted the tassel to hang from. Once I had my knot in place, I strung on 3 wooden beads. I added just a tiny dot of hot glue over the knot so that the top bead would stay in place over the knot. Then with the 2 strings that were coming out from the bottom of the wooden beads, that's what I used to tie on my tassel. And that way the strings from the ends of that rope coming out from the top of the tag would be hidden within the tassel itself. And then I just finished off the tassel with another piece of the same twine, wrapping it around about 1 inch from the top of the tassel. In order to make sure there wasn't too much weight in each of the drawers, I put a big chunk of floral foam inside first, and then I added some of the decorative white rocks that you can find at the Dollar Tree. Once I had the surface of the floral foam hidden with the rocks, then I just tucked a succulent into each drawer. I know sometimes the Crafter's Square section can get pretty thin. They don't always have a lot of supplies, but one thing I can always find at Dollar Tree are these mini palettes. I wanted to create some solar lights to set on the picnic table outside of our camper, so I grabbed 8 of these mini palettes and also 2 of the solar lights from the Dollar Tree. They have a bunch of different colored tops, but I went with the bronze color. Sometimes when I'm creating box shapes, I find it's really hard to get the corners right. So I laid my T-square down, and there's not a lot of surface area on these palettes to add glue to, but I was able to add some hot glue to 2 of the crossbars, and when I tucked it into the corner of my T-square, it gave it a nice square shape. Now I use the Gorilla Glue sticks here, and I've always had good luck on wood with these. They always have a good hold for me, but if you haven't had good luck, you might want to try using some wood glue here. Sometimes I do a wood glue, hot glue combination, but like I said, since there wasn't a lot of space on the palette, I didn't have enough room to add both glues. In order to make my box even more sturdy, I went through and added hot glue in each of the corners on the inside just for a little extra security. Since there were crossbars on the inside of the palette at the top and bottom, I was able to add glue to both sides, and that really held this up. I even set this outside to charge the solar lights up, and it's been really hot here in PA, and none of my glue came apart. I needed to create a base for at the base of my solar light. I have these wood squares in my stash. I'm not even sure where they came from. Maybe Amazon, maybe Temu. They're super thin, but they're 5x5 squares, and they were a little too big to fit inside of my solar light. I measured mine, and I cut mine down to 4 1/4 by 3 3/8 of an inch, but I would take a measurement of your own first just to make sure that it'll fit inside. And again, because those crossbars are inside the palette, this was able to slip right inside and just sit on top of those. Now these solar lights come in a few pieces. There's always a tab here, so if you want to check yours before you leave the store, you can pull that tab out, and if you put your hand over the top, you can see if it works or not. I'm not going to need the stake part of the solar light, so I just took that off, and using a combination of E6000 and hot glue, I wanted to make sure that this was really sturdy on that base that I had created out of that piece of really thin wood. So I'm using the E6000 at the bottom of the solar light, and I placed it in the middle. I held it there for just a second, and then I got my hot glue out, and I started really piling it on around the outside just to make sure that it had that long-term, short-term hold. And like I said, I added a lot of hot glue around the edges here so that it would have a little bit of a buildup and be more sturdy. Now the tricky part with this is you have to let it sit for a little bit so that that hot glue has a chance to cool so that it doesn't wobble over. And you can see even after the light is connected to that platform, it slips inside of that box really easily. And this is great too because if something happens to that solar light, it can easily be replaced. Now there's a ton of different ways that you could choose to decorate yours. You could even leave just the natural wood because I do think that these palettes are a really pretty natural color, but I wanted to darken mine up a little bit and have more of a rustic feel. I'm using the Antique Wax by Waverly. A lot of times I like to apply this with a baby wipe because it kind of eliminates a step, but I really wanted a deep dark stain this time, so I'm applying it with a paintbrush, and this is also helping me get into the nooks and crannies. This took a little bit of time because there are so many small spaces, and I really wanted to cover everything, including the inside of this, so that none of that light wood would show through. Now, if you don't want to take the time to do this, like I said, you could leave the wood plain, or you could spray paint it, and I think it would help get into those nooks and crannies a little bit easier. And you can see I did go through with a baby wipe, taking off some of the extra, and I did go through and start applying it with the baby wipe, but once I realized it wasn't quite dark enough for me, I went back through with the paintbrush again and applied a little bit more. Once my stain had a chance to dry, I took some white chalk paint and I started dry brushing over the edges. I concentrated more of the paint on the top and the bottom of the box, and I just ran it lightly through the center. This gives it that distressed look that I really like. I wanted to give my box a little more character, so I dug around in my craft stash and I found some of these little stencils that have leaves and flowers on them. I took one of the stencils that has just a few leaves lined up, and using that same white chalk paint, I'm going to stencil over the box the whole way around to essentially create a border using this little mini stencil. Now, because I'm not afraid of a little bit of paint getting under my stencil and having the edges look a little blurred, I didn't bother taping this stencil down. I was just holding it in place with my fingers and pouncing the paint onto the stencil to bring out that design. Now, if you'd like more of a clean design, you might want to think about actually taping the stencil in place and then really taking your time as you're applying that paint. But like I said, I don't mind if it has a little bit of blurred edges. I think that looks really good. And I really like the monochromatic look of having the box distressed with the white chalk paint and then also having the stencil done in the same chalk paint. Even though it's the same color, it looks different because it's thicker when you put it on with the stencil. So once I had the border created the whole way around the box, then I went through with that single leaf and I just added a few in the corners of each side. Even though these church style windows aren't technically wood pieces, I still keep them in my wood stash because I just think they're so cute. And every time I find them in the Dollar Tree, I always have to grab one or two because they always have them in different colors. So this project's really quick. I'm just going to use that and one of these small wooden crates. Now, I really liked the color of the window, and I even liked the little sign that was already on it. So the only thing I needed to prep was the small wooden crate. And I'm using the Antique Wax by Waverly here. I'm just using a baby wipe to apply it, but I did have to use a paintbrush to get into the smaller areas of the crate because I wanted to make sure that I had everything covered on the outside and the inside. A lot of times I take the signs off of these windows, but I actually really liked this one, so I wanted to keep it, but you could see that it was glued on crooked, so I did have to remove it so that I could put it in a better position. I wanted to move it up a little bit higher so that it wouldn't get covered by the crate, and I just used some hot glue to attach it. To add a little touch of decoration to the top of the window, I grabbed a few pieces of eucalyptus that I had laying around. I put the branches together in the center and gave it a small bend so that it would fit the arch of the window. I held those in place with a piece of clear tape, and then to cover up the clear tape, I just went through with some regular jute cord and wrapped it over the center. And then I used that same jute cord, I doubled it up, and I created a bow for at the top. And because I put that bend in the greenery stems, I was able to hot glue it right to the top of the window, and it fit perfect over the sign. I am going to use hot glue to attach my crate to the bottom of my window, but because the window material is plastic, I was afraid that the hot glue wouldn't have enough grip. So I'm using a nail file here just to rough up the surface of the frame, and then I also roughed up the bottom part of the crate just to make sure that I would have a better hold when I added my hot glue. So I lined my crate up with the bottom of the window and I centered it from side to side. To give a little extra security to the crate, I took one craft stick and I cut it down so that it was the same width of the crate. Then I added hot glue to the seam between the frame and the crate and placed that craft stick over top of it. Now, I didn't really think you would be able to see the bottom of the crate, but just in case, I went through with the same antique wax and covered up that craft stick so that it would blend in. Now, there's a lot of different ways you could use this little church window. You could add some flowers to the crate, but I think I'm going to put tea bags in mine and hang it next to my coffee bar. you've been hanging out with me for a while, you probably know that I love to make sets of coasters. So I actually don't have a set of nautical inspired coasters. I grabbed 4 of the mini palettes from the Dollar Tree and also 1 of these mini crates, and I'm basically just going to give these a paint job. Since the mini crate already had 3 lines on the long sides of it, I decided to use the plaster color and paint that on the short sides, and then I used the plaster color to paint the top and bottom section of the long sides. And I actually used the Ocean color by Waverly. It's a really pretty dark blue, and I painted the center section of each side of the crate with that color. I decided to paint each of the coasters slightly different. So for some of them, I alternated the 2 colors, the plaster and the ocean. Some of them I painted the plaster on the outside pieces and I painted the ocean on the inside pieces, and on one of them I reversed it. It's really up to you how you want to customize this. I think it's really fun to go in and kind of do your own thing. After my paint was dry, I did go over all of the surfaces of the coasters with 1 coat of Mod Podge just to help waterproof it a little. As a final embellishment on my crate, I took some thicker jute twine that I got at Walmart, and I just wrapped each handle of the crate with a row of jute twine. Another fun thing I found at that Dollar Tree Plus was this wooden pallet sign for $3, and it does have a hanger on it, but it's hanging in the wrong direction that I want my sign to hang. So I had to cut that rope off first, which was no big deal. And then I knew I wanted to create a simple little wreath for in the center, so I found something that would be about the right size, and I went back and forth if I wanted the roll of painter's tape or the dish, but in the end I decided the painter's tape was a better size for this palette. So then I took that painter's tape and I traced it out onto a scrap piece of cardboard and I cut it out. After my circle was cut, I went back through with a pair of scissors and I cut the center of the circle out, leaving about an inch gap the whole way around so that my new little mini wreath form is about an inch wide, kind of like a donut. I knew I was going to cover the cardboard wreath form up with flowers, but just in case any of it stuck out from underneath any of the flowers or the greenery, I decided to just take some thicker jute cord and wrap it the whole way around my cardboard ring. Now for the fun part, I took some scrap greenery pieces and some other little flowers that I had at my stash, and I started by just laying greenery around the whole base of the wreath form, and then I went back through with some little mini flowers and I filled in the gaps between the greenery. After my wreath was all finished, I just used some hot glue to attach it to the center of the palette. Like I mentioned earlier, the rope that was on this palette was in the wrong direction for what I wanted to do, but instead of just hot gluing another rope onto the palette in the other direction, I decided to make it a little fancier and I strung together some mini wooden beads to use as my hanger. Once I had the beads to the length that I like, all I needed to do was hot glue it on the back. I had this idea for a really cool rustic looking planter, so I went to the Dollar Tree and I grabbed a couple packs of seeds, some of these wood planks, and the tumbling tower blocks. Now the seed packets, it really doesn't matter which ones you grab. I decided just to get 4 of the ones that had a flower picture on the front because I'm really going for the image that's on the front of the seed package. I started by cutting the top off of the packages. So once I had all of the tops cut and the seeds poured into a container, I just cut the image off the front of the packet. I wasn't too worried about the numbers showing or anything like that because I was going to do a lot of distressing to it to make these look a bit older. To start distressing these seed packets, I decided to tear around the perimeter of each image. Now, if you're gonna distress something like paper, it's always better if you rip toward yourself. That way you'll leave a little bit of that white border from the inside of the paper showing. If you would tear away from yourself, it would be more of a clean tear, if that makes any sense. But this way, with the paper showing, once you apply ink or paint or anything like that, it will grab onto the white part of the paper a little more. Since these are newer seed packets, I decided to run my sanding block lightly over the surface just to help cut down on that shine and to make them look a little more weathered. I really wanted these to look pretty old and vintage. I'm sure if you didn't want to go through the hassle of doing all of these steps to these seed packets, you probably could look online for some free like vintage seed packet printables, or even go on Etsy. I'm sure there's printables for sale over there. So once I had them all scratched up, then I just started crumpling them up into little balls just to give more texture to the surface of the packets. Next, I wanted to get started on making the planter box that I'm gonna put the seed packets on. So I took 8 of the tumbling tower blocks and I just hot glued 2 of them together long ways. I always use the Gorilla Glue sticks, but if you'd rather, you could definitely use wood glue for this. These tumbling tower blocks are going to act as braces for the inside of the planks. Because these planks are a little thin, I thought it would be easier to glue the planks onto the tumbling tower blocks rather than trying to glue the planks together. That way I didn't have to worry so much about any of the hot glue seeping out between the seams. So I laid a set of 2 blocks down on one of the planks pretty close to the edge. I left enough of a gap so that another plank could fit on top of it, and then I just hot glued the next plank at the 90-degree angle. And then I went to the other side and did the same thing. And once I had 2 of the planks glued onto the side plank, then I reinforced the inside with more hot glue. And then the last thing I had to do was glue on the other 2 sets of tumbling tower blocks to the opposite sides of the planks, and then attach the 4th plank with glue. And then I went back through on the inside and reinforced as much as I could with hot glue. And it didn't matter if it was a little messy because you wouldn't be able to see it anyway. Next, I gave my box one good coat of the Plaster Color by Waverly. You'll have to let me know in the comments, does your Walmart still sell the Waverly chalk paint? Because I've heard that some aren't. Mine still seems to be selling it for now, so I hope they continue because I love the Plaster Color. I'm going to use a Tim Holtz ink to distress everything. This one's called Walnut Stain, and I wanted to show you that if you get the little ink blender pads, they fit perfectly on the back side of these mini cube inks. So I always just keep one of the blender pads tucked in underneath the back side of it, and then that way I don't have to worry about switching colors or mixing colors together on the pad. So I just used my ink blender and I went all around the outside edges of my torn and tattered up seed packets. And then because I did sand the surface of these, I ran the ink blender lightly over the surface of each packet too, because I knew some of those sanding marks would pick up some of that ink. I wanted the distressing in the seed packets to be cohesive with the planter box, so I decided just to use the same ink around the edges of the planter box. And you can see here, I'm just blending around all 4 sides of the panels, the wood planks, because I didn't feel the need to put much through the center because I knew the seed pack was going to cover that up anyway. And what's nice about the ink blenders is you can do as little or as much distressing as you want. I don't always really care for Mod Podge that much because sometimes it really bothers me how much it wrinkles paper. But for this project, I knew it would be perfect because the paper was already wrinkled because I crinkled it into a ball. So I used the matte Mod Podge and I just gave one side of the container a good coat of it, and then I laid my seed packet on top of it. And I didn't think ahead, but it worked out okay because the ink that I used was water-based and there's a lot of water in Mod Podge. It kind of started smearing the ink around, which worked out for this project because I didn't mind if the ink was kind of everywhere. I really wanted it to look kind of dirty and weathered and rustic. And it started to blend into the sponge, so you can't really see it on camera, but the Mod Podge that was on my sponge was starting to get stained. So when I got to this side of my box and I realized I didn't ink around the edges, I already had so much Mod Podge on it, I thought, oh, I'm just gonna go with it. And so I just put my Mod Podge on and my seed packet, and then there was enough ink that had transferred into the Mod Podge on my sponge brush that it actually made it look a little more tinted. It definitely didn't have as much distressing as the other three sides, and that was okay. I just made sure that this one kind of faced the back wall. After the coat of Mod Podge had dried, I took a piece of chipboard that I had cut down to fit inside of the box. I couldn't use another one of the wood planks because it kind of overlapped on the edges and I didn't really like how it looked. And I knew I wasn't putting a lot of weight inside of this box, so I figured the chipboard would be fine. Then I just added some floral foam and some of my favorite greenery and some of my favorite picks from the Dollar Tree. I really like these roses that they have out this year for spring. I think they're really pretty. And I'm so excited how this planner turned out because I had it pictured in my head and it turned out exactly how I wanted it, you know, except for the one side that I forgot to distress, but we won't talk about that. The bamboo cutting boards from the Dollar Tree are a great base to start with when you don't have a lot of time to craft. I'm going to use 2 of these today, and I'm also using some really large wooden beads that I had in my stash. I wanted to rough up the surface of these cutting boards just a bit around the outside because they do have a slight finish to them and I was afraid that the hot glue wouldn't take. So I'm just using a sanding block and I'm just going around the outside edges of one side of each of the cutting boards, kind of framing it out so that my glue would take a little bit better. Starting in one corner of the cutting board, now this is the side that I sanded on. I didn't sand on the other side. I just started hot gluing my giant wood beads down. I did the 2 longer sides of the cutting board first, and then I went through and did the shorter side so that I could space the beads out a little bit easier. Now I like the 2 tones of the wood here. I love the color of the bamboo cutting board and I like the natural wood of the beads, but if you didn't care for that, you could go ahead and paint or stain these however you like. But again, I'm trying to keep this project quick, so I left them as is. Once I had all of my wooden beads in place around the first cutting board, then on my second cutting board, again on the side that I sanded on, I ran hot glue around the edges and I just placed it on top, making sure that it was even with the bottom one. To elevate this riser a little bit more, I'm using those same large wooden beads and I hot glued one into each corner to act as feet. I wanted to keep the decorating simple, so I'm using some rub-on transfers. Now this video is not sponsored, but this company, Essential Stencil, did send me these for free, so I've been anxious to try these out. I found this really pretty floral grouping that fit really well on the top of this riser. I just had to cut one of the extra little leaves off so that it could fit in the corner of my cutting board. I laid it on top and the plastic tool that they sent with it to rub on the transfer didn't really work that great, so I did end up taking out my Cricut scraper and I was using that to rub the transfer on. But I was really impressed with these transfers. I thought the detail was really pretty, and once I had a harder piece of plastic to rub it on, it went a lot smoother. Like I said, they aren't sponsoring this video, but I did want to let you know that they did send this to me for free. But I will make sure that I have a link to their website in the description box. They also recommend that once you have your transfer in place, you seal it with some kind of sealer. So I'm using some polyacrylic here with a sponge brush, and I just gave it one thin coat over the top. On a recent trip to the Dollar Tree, I found these bamboo hoops at my store, which I'd seen other people haul, but this is the first that I saw them. And I had a really cool idea for a plant shelf. So I needed 2 packs of these bamboo rings, and I'm only going to use the larger rings for this project, so I'll save the smaller rings for another time. And I also need a pack of these wall shelves that you can find at the Dollar Tree. There's actually 2 in a pack, but I only need 1 for this project as well. I decided to leave both of my rings and my shelf just the natural wood color that they already were because I liked how they looked. For the rings, I took some thicker jute cord. I get this one from Walmart. It's a little thicker than the stuff that you can find at the Dollar Tree. And I just added a little hot glue to the outside of the ring, and I started wrapping the jute cord until I had about 1.5 inches wrapped. And then I double backed on itself because I wanted to make sure that there was a thicker amount of jute wrapped around this ring. So once I had about 1.5 inches wrapped around, then I went back the other direction, and so it's basically a double layer of jute that I had wrapped just in one place. And I did that on both rings. Next, I used my ruler to find the center point of the two longer sides on the shelf, and I used a pencil to mark where the center was. I did my best to line the jute cord up with the center points on the shelf, and then I used a piece of painter's tape to tape the two top pieces of the rings together, if that makes any sense, because I needed the right angle before I could glue the rings to the shelf. I added a little hot glue, and I knew this would hold well because of the texture of the rope, which is one of the reasons that I actually used the rope on there. It added a little element of decoration, and it was also functional. So once I had them tacked in place with a small amount of hot glue, then I turned the whole thing over and I added more hot glue on the bottom just to make sure that it was really secure. So the key with this is after you get that hot glue on the bottom, you have to really let it set up before you can move on to the next step. I took the painter's tape off of the top of the rings, and I'm using another piece of that thicker jute cord, and I tied it around the two rings, and then once I cut off a little of the excess on the shorter tail, then I used the longer tail to wrap it around the top of the rings. It's kind of hard to see at this angle, but I did start off to one side so that once I started wrapping the jute down, then the whole piece of jute would be centered on the top of the rings. Wanted to have the option of either setting this somewhere or hanging it somewhere, and since there were already holes drilled into this wall shelf, it made it really easy to be able to hang this if I wanted to. There is some white rope that comes with this wall shelf kit, but since I was using jute cord everywhere else, I decided to use the same jute that I was already using to hang this. So I strung the jute from the top down through the bottom, and then I added on a wood bead that's actually the same color as the wood in the ring and the shelf, so it all was nice and cohesive. And then I added a few knots to make sure that bead wasn't going to go anywhere. I measured out how long I think I needed the rope to be to hang it, and then I fished the other end down through on the other side. And I did the same thing. I added a bead and I tied a few knots just to make sure that everything would stay in place. And then of course I repeated that on the other side of the shelf as well. I gathered both sets of loops up towards the top of the rings, and I made sure that there was a good amount of tension on the strings coming from the shelves. And you'll be able to see here in a minute that my loops actually weren't the same length, and that's okay. I was able to make some adjustments later so that I could still hang it if I wanted to. I used another piece of jute just to help tie those two pieces together, and I made sure that I tied it in a double knot to make it really secure. I took all 4 strands that were coming up from the shelf and I tied one big knot as far up as I could. Now, because I had one loop that was slightly shorter than the other, I tied the knot up as high as I could where that shorter loop was, and then once I had my knot in place, I just clipped off the shorter of the 2 loops and added just a tiny amount of hot glue to make sure that that rope wasn't going to go anywhere. And once the glue was all set and dried, you couldn't see that there was another piece of rope tucked down in there. And then I just cut off the extra tails of that piece of jute that tied the 2 loops together. I don't always do this, but this jute cord that I was using seemed to be awfully fuzzy, so I took a lighter and I just lightly went over each of the jute cords just to burn off some of those extra fuzzy pieces. I had this really pretty blue jar on hand from the Dollar Tree last year, I believe. So I added that to the center of the shelf, and then I just tucked in a few of my favorite pieces of greenery. I'm going to use one of these wooden trays along with a pack of these wooden dowels that you can find at the Dollar Tree. I only found one pack at my Dollar Tree, so if you have a hard time finding them, they do sell them at Walmart as well. I dug around in my little hardware stash and I found this small gold hook. I'm going to use this along with the dowel and the tray to create a wreath hanger or a picture hanger that can be changed out for any holiday or any season. I'm using a combination of E6000 and hot glue to attach my hook to my wooden dowel. The only thing I would suggest when you're picking out a piece of hardware for your dowel is just to make sure that it's thin enough that you have enough surface area to attach to the wooden dowel. Once I had the gold hook in place about 1.5 inches from the top of the dowel, then to attach my dowel into the tray, I'm using a combination of wood glue and hot glue. So you can see here, I put the wood glue right in the center of the dowel and a little hot glue around the outside. Once I had it centered inside of the tray and I held it in place for just a minute for it to set, then I went back in with some more hot glue all around the base and I added a really generous amount and I built it up on the sides just a little, just to make sure that it was nice and secure. Now, the reason that I didn't drill in from the bottom to hold this dowel in place is because the wood on the tray is so thin, I was afraid it was going to crack. Then I went outside and I grabbed some white spray paint. This is a high gloss by Rust-Oleum, and I gave the whole piece 2 coats of the white paint, and I made sure that I got that hook covered too, that way it blended in with the wood. I want to show you how to make a really quick wreath using things that you probably already have on hand. I started by laying a circular object down on a piece of scrap cardboard. This is just one of those burner covers that you can get at the Dollar Tree in the smaller size. And then I found something smaller that would fit inside it. In this case, it's a larger ribbon roll, and you can see I just created a circle shape with another circle inside of it. Then I took my utility knife and going around the outside of the larger circle, I cut that shape out first. And then once I had that cut out, then I used my utility knife again to cut out the inner circle, leaving me with a cardboard ring. I grabbed some thicker jute twine. I get this at Walmart. It's a little bit thicker than the stuff you can get at the Dollar Tree. And starting on one side of the circle, I just added a little hot glue and secured my twine in place with some clear tape. And then I just put on a good podcast and got to work on wrapping this whole ring. It was a little time consuming, I'm not going to lie, but you'll be able to use this ring over and over for different holidays and different seasons, so it's definitely worth it in the end. As I was wrapping, I just made sure that I had the jute twine up against the previous row, but not too tight because I didn't want to accidentally warp the cardboard. Once I was the whole way around the ring, then I just secured the other end with a little more hot glue. Now, the great thing about using the cardboard here is that it's very similar in color to the jute string. So if there were any little gaps here and there, you couldn't really notice them because the colors blended in. So the little advice that I have is if you decide not to use jute string, if you want to use yarn or ribbon or something like that, I would maybe paint the cardboard first a similar color just so that as you're wrapping and you have little gaps, you can camouflage those into whatever you're using. Now the next thing I'm doing is just creating a little bow with some greenery for the top of my wreath. You can see I did an awareness ribbon style bow here where I just looped it over on itself, and I'm using some more of that jute cord to secure the center, and then I added in a few pieces of greenery. Now, since I already have that jute cord in place, I'm not going to glue this bow to the top of the wreath. I'm just going to use that jute cord to tie it up there so that I can switch it out whenever I need to. And then using those same tails, I added another knot so that I have a little loop at the top that I can hang from my hook. I also suggest adding a few rocks to the bottom of the tray just for a little extra weight so that when you hang your wreath or any picture that you want, it doesn't tip it over. Thanks so much for coming to hang out with me again today. If you need even more crafting inspiration, check out one of the videos I left on the screen. All right, everyone, I hope you have a great week, and I'll talk to you in the next one.